My name is Dr. Irina Vasilieva Morozova. I am a forensic case analyst and legal documentation specialist, formally attached to the Rostov Oblast Prosecutor's Office through a joint academic arrangement with the Institute of Criminology in Moscow. I am writing this account not as testimony. Testimony implies an audience, a court, a formal proceeding with rules of admissibility and objection. I am writing this because I have spent the better part of the last 8 years trying to organize what I witnessed into something that behaves like a coherent professional record, and I have failed every single time. The words rearrange themselves into something that sounds like hysteria. So I am going to try once more from the beginning in the plainest language I know, and I am going to commit to not softening a single detail. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I am not a superstitious woman. I was raised in a household that treated religion as a relic of pre-Soviet provincialism, and I carried that skepticism into my academic training and into my professional life. I believe in evidence. I believe in procedure. I believe in the orderly documentation of facts. I tell you this because what I am about to describe will sound in several places like the account of a woman who has lost her grip on observable reality. I have not. What happened in that archive room in Rostov-on-Don in the winter of 1993 was real. The cold was real. The files were real. And what I heard, what answered me from the far side of a room I was certain was empty, was real. You need to understand the context of the case before you can understand what the case did to the people who touched it. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was arrested for the final time in November of 1990. He was convicted on February 14th of 1992, Valentine's Day, the Feast of Lovers, a date that would have struck anyone paying close attention as a grotesque joke written by history, and he was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head in February of 1994. In the time between his arrest and his execution, he confessed to 56 murders. The court accepted 52. He had been committing these crimes since 1978, 12 years. 3 full Olympic cycles. The entire childhoods of an entire generation of Soviet children who grew up in the regions where he hunted the Rostov Oblast, the Krasnodar Krai. Parts of the Ukrainian SSR grew up with a specific kind of fear their parents could not name and could not protect them from because the Soviet state refused, for most of those 12 years, to publicly acknowledge that a serial killer was operating within its borders. The concept of the serial killer was officially classified as a Western phenomenon, a product of capitalist social decay, a symptom of the corrupted individualism that flourished in societies without the moral architecture of collective socialist progress. It could not exist here. The state had said so. And so the investigation was suppressed and redirected and buried under administrative interference so thick and deliberate that when I finally read through the full operational timeline of the case, the internal memos, the suppressed forensic reports, the directives from party officials instructing regional investigators to reframe the murders as isolated incidents of social deviance rather than the systematic predation of a single actor, I had to stop and sit with my head in my hands for a long time. More than 50 human beings died because of that ideology, because the state found it more important to protect an idea about itself than to protect the people who actually lived inside it. Children died because a political system could not admit that monsters were possible within its borders. I want you to hold that fact for a moment before I continue. Hold it the way I have held it every single day since I opened the first box of files in that building in Rostov. And I want to be specific about what holding it actually means, because I think the number 52 invites a kind of cognitive mercy that I am not willing to extend. 52 is a number that the mind processes as a statistic. Statistics are manageable. Statistics can be placed inside a sentence with a period at the end and then moved past. But the files do not allow this. The files contain names, they contain ages, they contain the individual case reports, thin typed pages, each one a contained world, and the ages in those reports range from 7 years old to 45. 7 years old. I want you to sit with the word 7 for a moment. Not the statistic, the word, the duration of a life of 7 years, the specific smallness of that. The files contain a photograph standard evidentiary documentation of a red wool mitten, child-sized, found at one of the sites. The mitten is tagged, numbered, referenced in the inventory. It appears in the photograph exactly as it would appear in reality. A small red wool mitten, one of a pair, separated from its match in a forest outside a Soviet industrial city in the autumn of 1982. I do not know what happened to the other mitten. The file does not say. I have thought about this more than I should have, and I am including it here because I think the mitten is the closest I can come to explaining what the files actually do to the person reading them. They are full of small, specific objects that refuse to become abstractions. They resist the mercy of statistics. I arrived in Rostov-on-Don in the second week of January 1993. The conviction had been handed down the previous February, and the case documentation, staggering in volume, literally measured in cubic meters of paper, had been partially transferred to a regional archive facility while the appeal process continued in Moscow. I had been engaged by a research consortium with the specific task of producing an analytical summary of the investigative methodology, what the Soviet investigative apparatus had done right across those 12 years, what it had done catastrophically wrong, and what systemic lessons could be extracted for the newly formed Russian Federation's approach to violent crime investigation going forward. It was, on paper, a dry administrative task, the kind of work that produces reports that no one reads until they need them, and then they need them very badly and all at once. I had done similar work before. Case review, investigative analysis, the retrospective examination of institutional failure. This was my professional specialty, and I was good at it. I want to be clear about this because I think it is relevant to what follows. I was not a novice. I had reviewed files from the Gulag administrative apparatus. I had worked through the documentation of the Novocherkassk massacre of 1962, the event in which Soviet troops opened fire on striking factory workers, and the state then spent 28 years officially denying that it had happened. I had read the autopsy reports, the internal communications, the suppression orders. I had read things that I do not discuss in professional contexts and that I will not discuss here. What I am telling you is that I was not easily disturbed. I had developed, over the course of a decade in this kind of work, something that I would describe not as callousness, but as professional containment, the ability to be present with difficult material without being dismantled by it. I was good at this. I believed I was good at this. I want you to hold that belief alongside everything else I am about to tell you, because the distance between that belief and what actually happened to me in that archive room is the most frightening thing I have to report. The archive facility was located in a converted municipal building in the central district of the city. The building had been a records office during the Soviet period, briefly converted to temporary administrative housing during a period of bureaucratic reorganization, then repurposed as archive storage. It had the particular smell of such places: mildew, old paper, and the metallic undertone of Soviet-era heating systems working at half capacity against a cold that was that January. Extraordinary, even by Rostov standards. The city sits at a latitude that should make it relatively mild. It is in the south of Russia, on the Don River, at the northern edge of a temperate zone that the geography textbooks describe with a kind of optimism the climate does not always share. But January of 1993 brought temperatures that cracked pipes and killed the city's old trees in ways that would not become visible until spring. The windows of the archive building were perpetually fogged on the inside. When you pressed your palm against the glass, the cold came through like a slow hand pressing back. I was given a room on the second floor. A metal table, 2 chairs, a lamp with a bulb that flickered occasionally in a way I attributed to the building's aging electrical wiring. The files were brought to me in batches by an archivist named Galina, a woman in her late 50s with a face that had been doing the work of expression for so long it had largely stopped bothering with subtlety. She brought boxes, signed forms, left without commentary. On my first day, I asked her how long she had been working with these particular files. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I classified, at the time, as professional neutrality. Since they arrived, she said, I do not read them. I thought this was a statement about protocol. I understand it differently now. The routine of those first days was as follows. I arrived at 8 a.m. I signed the access register in the entrance hall, a heavy ledger with a canvas cover, the kind that institutional buildings had been using since before the revolution, and apparently saw no reason to retire. I took the stairs to the second floor. I entered the room, set my briefcase on the second chair, placed my notepad and my pencils in the arrangement I had used since graduate school. Notepad parallel to the left edge of the table, pencils in a row above it, sharpest first. I positioned the lamp. I took the first box from the shelf where Galina had left it the evening before, and I began. I worked until approximately 1 p.m. when I walked to a cafe 2 blocks away for tea and a sandwich that was always the same sandwich, regardless of what the chalkboard claimed the daily offering to be. I returned it too. I worked until 6. I replaced the boxes on the shelf, arranged my notes, capped my pencils, and left. This is the kind of detail that sounds tedious to report, and that I am reporting anyway, because the routine mattered. The routine was the structure I was living inside, and when the structure began to show its first cracks, I want you to understand how far it had to travel to get there. The files themselves were organized in the fashion typical of Soviet legal documentation, densely typed on thin paper with handwritten annotations in the margins from a variety of hands, reflecting the extraordinary number of investigators, examiners, and officials who had passed through the case over its 12-year span. The language was formal and procedural in the way that Soviet bureaucratic writing always was a mode of expression that had developed specifically to drain events of their emotional content and render them as administrative. Facts. This was, I had always thought, a reasonable approach to documentation. It creates distance. Distance is useful when you are trying to think clearly about difficult things. But I discovered, over those first few days in the archive room, that the particular events this documentation described had a way of filling the distance back in. The procedural language was a container, and the contents pressed against it from the inside. I will tell you what the files contained, because to skip past it would be to participate in exactly the kind of institutional suppression that allowed this case to continue for as long as it did. Andrei Chikatilo was born in 1936 in a small village in the Ukrainian SSR, into conditions of starvation so severe that during the Holodomor famine of the early 1930s, before he was born, but not before its effects had finished reshaping his family, his older brother Stepan had been cannibalized by starving neighbors. This was a story Chikatilo claimed to have been told as a child. Criminologists who reviewed his psychological profile later noted that this origin story, whether factually accurate or mythologized over the years, had become a kind of organizing framework for his self-understanding. He was, in his own internal narrative, a man born downstream of an act of consumption, someone who came from a lineage of being devoured. There are researchers who argue this meant nothing in terms of causation, and they may be right. The majority of people born into circumstances of equal or greater trauma do not become what Andrei Chikatilo became. But I include it because it is in the file and because the file is what I am here to report. He was a married man, a father. He worked for most of his active killing years as a supply clerk, a position that required him to travel regularly between cities and towns throughout the southern Soviet Union, which is to say it provided him with an alibi structure that was essentially built into his job description. He traveled on trains. He waited at bus stops. He approached runaways and hitchhikers and children separated from their parents and young women with nowhere to stay the night. He was, by all accounts of those who worked alongside him for years, unremarkable to the point of invisibility. There is a witness account in the files from a colleague who had shared an office with him for 6 years. The man said, when interviewed after the arrest, that he was struggling to picture Chikatilo's face, even though he had seen it every working day for half a decade. He was there. The man said, but not in a way that stayed. He was arrested for the first time in 1984 for unrelated petty theft. During that arrest, blood samples were taken, standard procedure. The blood type returned as type A. The semen samples recovered from several of the murder victims indicated a type AB secretor. Investigators concluded, on the basis of this discrepancy, that Chikatilo could not be the perpetrator. They released him. They filed this conclusion with apparent confidence in the routine reliability of their forensic procedure. What no one knew, or what no one in the investigative apparatus had encountered before, was that Chikatilo was a statistical anomaly. Approximately 1 in a million people are non-concordant secretors, individuals whose blood type as expressed in their blood does not match their blood type as expressed in other biological fluids. His blood said one thing, his body said another. The science existed to explain this. The investigators simply had not known to look for it. They released a man who had already killed more than 30 people because their testing procedure could not account for a biological exception so rare it had essentially never been encountered in a Soviet forensic laboratory. They then arrested another man for several of Chikatilo's murders. That man was convicted. That man was executed. I am going to pause on that for a moment because I think it deserves the weight of a pause. An innocent man was identified, tried, convicted, and shot for murders he did not commit, while the man who committed them traveled on to kill more people. This is documented. This is in the file. The name of the man executed is Alexander Kravchenko. He was 25 years old when he was shot. When I found the page of the file that contained this information, I put it down on the metal table and I sat very still for a while, looking at the flickering lamp, and I thought about the kind of institutional confidence it takes to execute a man, the certainty that must exist somewhere in the system, the certainty that the system has not failed, cannot fail, will not have failed in order for that act to be carried out. With the procedural calm the documentation suggests. The form for Kravchenko's execution is in the file. It is signed, it is dated, it is filed correctly. I want to tell you something about that form specifically because I keep returning to it. The form is 2 pages. The first page is the authorization, the legal summary, the confirmation that all appeals have been exhausted, the official determination that the sentence is to be carried out. The second page is the record of execution itself, the time, the method, the location, the names of the attending officials. Both pages are in the correct order. Both pages bear the correct stamps. Everything about the document is exactly as it should be, and that exactness is the horror. Kravchenko was a real person, a young man with a name and a case number, and he was killed by a system that was absolutely confident in its own correctness, that produced documentation as orderly and calm as a filing of tax records to commemorate the fact that it had ended his life. And then that system went on, and the documentation went into a box, and the box went into an archive. And 12 years later, I sat in a second floor room in a building that smelled of mildew and opened that box and found it. The documentation had not changed. The system had not apologized. The files simply waited, the way files do, to be read by someone who understood what they were reading. Chikatilo went on killing for 6 more years after Kravchenko was executed. 6 years. The system killed the wrong man and then continued failing for 6 more years to catch the right one. The lamp flickered and the cold pressed against the window, and I thought about that form for a long time. It was on the 5th day that I first noticed something wrong with the room. The archive room was not large, perhaps 4 meters by 5. Metal shelving along 2 walls, the table in the center, a narrow window that looked out onto an interior courtyard the building had never apparently found a use for. The courtyard held a bench, a dead tree, and a great deal of compacted snow. I had looked at this view so many times over those first 4 days that I could have described it without looking. The bench, the tree, the gray-white compression of the snow that had been there since before I arrived. The window was my reference point. When the work became too heavy, and it became too heavy regularly, I would look up from the files and out at the courtyard, and I would remind myself that I was in a room, in a building, in a city, in a world that continued to exist outside of what I was reading. On the 5th day, in the middle of the afternoon, at approximately 2:30, I looked up from the files, and the courtyard bench had moved. Not dramatically, not across the courtyard. It had simply rotated, slightly, so that it now faced a different direction than it had faced when I arrived that morning. I know how this sounds. I am recording it anyway. My first thought was that someone had moved it. Maintenance, perhaps, clearing snow, knocking the bench sideways in the process. My second thought was that this was a reasonable explanation and I should return to the files. I returned to the files. I did not return to the courtyard with my eyes again that day. The 6th day passed without incident. The 7th day, I found the box that contained Chikatilo's personal materials, notebooks, letters, items recovered from his apartment and his workplace. The notebooks were extraordinary. Not because they were confessional, but because they were not. He wrote about work schedules, about supply chain logistics, about procurement difficulties. He wrote in the same cramped, neat hand across hundreds of pages, and the murders are not in there. They exist in the space around the ordinary entries, the way a whole exists around its edges. You can see the shape of the absence if you look at what surrounds it. An entry on a Thursday in September of 1982 noting that the supply delivery was delayed and the weather had been poor, then nothing from the following Tuesday through Friday. Then an entry on the following Saturday noting that the weather had improved. In the space of that missing Tuesday through Friday, a 9-year-old girl had been found in a wooded area outside Shakhty. I know this because the forensic report is in the same archive, 2 boxes over, filed under a different reference number, as though the administrative system itself had tried not to see the connection. I had been reading these notebooks for perhaps 2 hours when I realized the room had gotten colder. Not the gradual ambient cooling that happened every afternoon as the heating system struggled against the outside temperature. This was different. It was directional. The cold was coming from the corner of the room to my left, the corner that held nothing but the end of a metal shelf, and a gap between the shelf and the wall where the flooring was original old parquet, dark and cracked, running back into shadow. I looked at the corner was empty, I returned to the notebook, the cold continued. I pulled my coat tighter and kept reading. I am a professional. Cold corners in old buildings are not significant findings. I want to describe the cold more precisely than I have because precision matters here. It was not simply a lower temperature radiating from that area of the room. Cold radiates. Cold spreads. The way cold from a window moves through a room is gradual and diffuse, seeking equilibrium, thinning as it travels. This cold did not do that. This cold was bounded. It occupied the corner with a kind of physical discretion present at the corner, diminishing rapidly within half a meter of it, as though whatever was producing it had a defined edge. I am a forensic analyst. I notice boundaries. The boundary of this cold was as distinct as the boundary between Chikatilo's crime sites and the cultivated land that surrounded them, and I did not consciously make that comparison in the moment, but I am making it now, and I believe it was the correct comparison to make. What happened next I have reconstructed carefully, because my memory of it has the particular quality of certain memories that are formed under stress, hyper-specific in some places and strangely blank in others. I remember the exact line I was reading in Chikatilo's notebook, a complaint about inadequate packing materials for a shipment of industrial components, when I heard, from the direction of the cold corner, a sound that I initially interpreted as settling. Old buildings settle. The parquet shifts in extreme cold. The metal shelving contracts. These are normal processes and they produce sounds, and I have been in enough old buildings to have a catalog of those sounds in my head, and I drew on that catalog in the moment to classify what I heard as ordinary. But then it came again, and it was not settling. It was breath, not my breath. I know the sound and rhythm of my own breathing, and what I heard was slower than mine and slightly irregular in a way that breathing sometimes becomes when the person breathing is trying to be quiet, when they are consciously moderating the sound of themselves. I have interviewed enough people in the course of my professional work, witnesses, officials, individuals in various states of disclosure, to know the difference between a person breathing freely and a person breathing with deliberate care. The second kind has a particular quality, a held back quality, a quality of something withheld. What I heard in the corner of that room had that quality. It was the breathing of something that did not want to be heard and was not quite succeeding in the concealment. I put the notebook flat on the table with the pages open, which is something I would normally never do to an archival document, and I looked at the corner again. The corner was empty. I sat very still and listened for approximately 30 seconds. Nothing. The heating system ticked. The lamp buzzed faintly. Outside the window, the dead tree in the courtyard stood, without moving in the windless cold. I looked back at the notebook. The open pages had changed. I want to be precise here, because precision is what I have, and I will not sacrifice it to make this easier to dismiss. When I placed the notebook flat on the table, the open pages showed entries from October of 1982, supply logistics, weather, an unsigned bureaucratic complaint. When I looked back at the notebook, after listening for the sound in the corner, the notebook was open to a different section. The pages that showed were from 1985. The handwriting was different, not Chikatilo's cramped professional script, but something looser, less controlled, written at an angle across the lines as though the writer had been moving while they wrote, or shaking. These were not pages I had seen before. They were not part of the section of notebooks I had been given access to. The archival stamp on the page margins indicated these were from a supplementary collection that was not supposed to be in my batch. I know this because I had the inventory list on the table beside the notebook, and I checked it twice before I allowed myself to draw any conclusions. The pages had no business being there. The notebook had no business being open to them. I read them anyway. They were not a confession, exactly. They were something stranger. They were descriptions. Chikatilo had written in that shaking hand descriptions of the forest clearings and riverbanks and weedy rail-adjacent scrubland where he had taken his victims, not the acts themselves, the places. The specific quality of light in each location, the sounds. In one entry, he described the sound of water moving through reeds at the edge of a canal in Krasnodar as being like breath, like something very large, breathing slowly just below the surface of the world. In another, he wrote about the way the shadows moved between trees in early evening in the forest outside Shakti, and I recognized, with a cold that had nothing to do with the room, that he was describing the same forest where the 9-year-old girl from my earlier reading had been found. He had written about these places with a quality I can only describe as longing, not regret, not horror at himself, longing, as though the places themselves were what he returned to, what he moved toward, what called him back again and again through those 12 years, as though the acts were incidental to the locations, as though he was, in some sense that I could not professionally classify, a creature of specific geography, tied to those stretches of Soviet industrial scrubland and riverbank and pine forest the way some organisms are tied to particular soil conditions, unable to reproduce anywhere else. I closed the notebook. I placed it in the box with the archival tag I had been using to mark my progress. Under normal professional protocol, I should have brought the misfiled pages to Galina's attention, immediately flagged the collection discrepancy, filled out the correction form, ensured the supplementary material was routed back to its correct batch. I did not do this. I am recording that decision here as part of the account because this document is a record of what I did as well as what I observed, and the two are not always the same thing. I placed the notebook in the box. I did not report the misfiling. I sat with my hands flat on the table for a moment, and I consciously did the exercise that my colleague in the criminology department, a woman who specializes in secondary trauma and first responders, had taught me years earlier. I named 5 things in the room. I could see. 4, I could hear. 3, I could physically feel. Table, lamp, box, files, window, heating system, lamp buzz, building settling, table surface, chair back, my own coat fabric, my own breath, my own breath. I counted 2 breathing sources in that room. One was mine, the other was still coming from the corner. I stood up from the table. I will tell you that my legs were unsteady, not because I am ashamed of this, but because it is true and this is a factual account. I stood up and I turned toward the corner and I looked at it with the full attention of both eyes, and I said out loud in a clear, professional voice, "Who is in this room?" Nothing answered from the corner. What answered was the lamp. It flickered twice in a pattern I had not seen before, not the gradual fade and return of a loose connection, but a sudden bilateral pulse, on, off, on, in a rhythm that reminded me, in the part of my brain I had not successfully turned off, of an eye blinking once. Then, steady again, I left the room. I walked down the hall to the area where Galina kept her desk, and I stood in her doorway and I said, "Is there anyone else in the building today?" She looked up from her own work. "Just maintenance in the basement until 4 p.m., she said. "They do not come to the upper floors." I said, "Has anyone else been in my room today?" She looked at me for a moment longer than was strictly required by the question. "No," she said. Then, after a pause, "Are you finding the files difficult?" I said, "No, thank you." I went back down the hall. I did not go back to the room. I collected my coat, which I had left on the chair, while standing in the doorway and not crossing the threshold. I want to be very clear about that detail because it mattered to me enormously in that moment in a way I cannot fully rationalize. I would not go past the threshold. Something in my body had decided this before my conscious professional mind had caught up. I stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame, and I looked at the room, the table, the lamp, the files in their ordered boxes, the window with its dead courtyard tree, and the corner was not empty anymore. I cannot tell you what was in it. I can tell you that the corner had a different quality than it had had on any previous day. That the shadow there was not the shadow of shelving and accumulated dark, but something that occupied space with a density that shadows do not have, and that when I looked at it directly, the breathing I had heard before resumed, slow and careful and only barely audible, and it did not stop when I looked. It continued. It was aware of being observed, and it continued. I reached in and took the coat from the chair by its collar, and I did not put my foot inside the room, and I left the building. I went back the following morning. I sat down at the table, opened the next batch of files, and returned to work as though the previous afternoon had been a minor disturbance in an otherwise unremarkable process. This is the thing I find most difficult to explain about the subsequent 2 weeks. Not the anomalies themselves, but my own response to them. I kept going back. Every morning at 8 a.m., every afternoon returning from the same cafe with the same sandwich, every evening replacing the boxes on the shelf and capping my pencils in order of sharpness. The routine was the structure, and I held to it with both hands. But the room was doing something to time. Not the way you lose track of time when you are absorbed in work, the pleasant dissolution of hours that passes without your noticing. This was the opposite. I was acutely aware of time, watching it, checking the institutional clock on the wall, the round kind that Soviet schools and offices had used for decades. White face and black numerals and a second hand that swept in clean mechanical arcs and finding that less time had passed than I had estimated. I would sit down at 8 a.m. and read and look up expecting it to be 10 or half past, and it would be 8:43. I would return from lunch and work and look up expecting 2 p.m. and it would be 1:15. The hours were stretching. The discrepancy grew over those 2 weeks, until, by the final days, I was sitting in that room for what felt like entire working days and looking up to find that 3 hours had passed. I know how this sounds. I am recording it as an observable fact. The room took more subjective time than it took objective time, and whatever was responsible for that distortion showed no sign of diminishing. I have since discussed this experience with a colleague who specializes in secondary traumatic stress in forensic workers. She has a clinical explanation involving dissociative time loss under sustained psychological pressure. I accept her clinical explanation. I include my subjective experience anyway, because the subjective experience is part of the record, and because I am not certain her explanation accounts for the directionality of the distortion. Time did not slip forward unnoticed. It stretched. There is a difference. I walked along the Don River for approximately an hour in the dark and the extraordinary cold of that January evening, and I thought about thresholds. I thought about the threshold of the room, specifically why my body had made that decision before my mind caught up to it, and whether the decision had been correct. I had been trained to move toward evidence, to not flinch, to maintain presence in difficult spaces. Everything in my professional formation had oriented me toward the idea that the most important thing was to stay in the room, because the room is where the information is, and the information is what matters. And my body had refused. My legs had taken me to the doorway and stopped there as absolutely as if I had walked into a wall, and my hand had reached in for my coat without the rest of me crossing the threshold, and I had left. And I was standing on the bank of the Don River in the dark at 6:30 in the evening in -15 Celsius, watching the city lights catch the ice forming at the river's edge, and I was trying to decide whether what my body had done was cowardice or recognition. I have thought about this question for 8 years, and I have not resolved it. I offer it to you without resolution. This is what I know, professionally, about Andrei Chikatilo and geography. The murders stopped when he was caught. This is expected. What is less expected, and what is documented in the investigative summary I eventually did produce, in the footnotes, where I was reasonably certain no senior official would read carefully, is that the locations where he committed his crimes showed a pattern that the Soviet investigative apparatus never fully analyzed because they were not looking for it. Because looking for it would have required them to admit they were looking for a serial killer, and they were not willing to do that. The pattern was geographic coherence. Every single confirmed site was within a specific ecological band, transitional zones between cultivated and uncultivated land, places where the Soviet industrial and agricultural project ended and something older began. The tree lines, the canal banks, the scrubby margins where the collective farm fields ran out and the indigenous riverine vegetation took over. Every site. He did not kill in cities. He passed through them. He commuted through them on trains and buses. He emerged from them at the edges, walked into the transitional zones, and that is where the bodies were found. The forensic botanist who reviewed the site evidence in 1991 noted that several of the sites shared specific plant species assemblages, particular combinations of sedgegrass, wild buckwheat, and riverbank elder that suggested the sites were not chosen randomly but selected for specific environmental characteristics. The Soviet system classified this observation as peripheral forensic data and did not include it in the primary investigative summary. I stood on the bank of the Don and I looked at the place where the city ended and the river began, the precise edge where the stone embankment gave way to frozen mud and then to ice and then to dark water, and I understood something about this case that I had not understood while sitting inside it. The case was about edges. It had always been about edges. Chikatilo was a creature of the threshold, the man who existed most fully in the transitional spaces, the places where one classification of the world ended and another began. The Soviet state had built its entire ideology on the erasure of such spaces on the collective, the systemic, the organized, the cultivated. It had pushed the wild to the margins. And the margins were exactly where he had gone. They could not find him because they could not bring themselves to look at the places they had told themselves did not matter. The edges of things, the places between the defined spaces on the Soviet map, where the ideological project had not yet fully reached. I included this analysis in my footnotes. It was not what the consortium had asked for. It was what the files gave me. I also included something I found at the very bottom of the last box of files Galina brought me on my final day in the archive 3 weeks after the incident with the corner and the breathing and the notebook that had rearranged itself. At the bottom of the box, beneath a folder of administrative correspondence about evidence storage logistics, was a single sheet of paper that did not appear in the inventory. It was not typed. It was handwritten. in the same cramped script I had spent 3 weeks learning to read, on the reverse side of what appeared to be a supply logistics form, the kind of form Chikatilo would have used dozens of times a week in his professional capacity. It was a list of locations, 17 of them, described in the same careful sensory language as the pages I had seen in the notebook that had opened itself, specific qualities of light, specific sounds, specific distances from specific landmarks. I spent the last hours of that final afternoon cross-referencing the list against the confirmed crime sites in the official documentation. It took longer than it should have. My hands were not entirely steady. 12 of the 17 matched confirmed sites. The remaining 5 did not appear anywhere in the official record. 5 locations that Chikatilo had described in careful, loving, sensory detail, which had never been investigated, which no one had ever looked at, which were in all likelihood exactly what the other 12 had been. Places where the old Russia met the new Russia, at the waterline, in the reeds, in the transitional dark, at the edge of things. I submitted my formal analytical report to the consortium in March of 1993. I did not include the single sheet in my submissions. I did not report it to the archive. I held it in my hand for a long time, that last afternoon, and then I placed it back exactly where I had found it at the bottom of the box, beneath the administrative correspondence, and I left it for whoever came next. I did not do this to conceal evidence. The man was convicted. The man was dead by the time I found it, or near enough to dead that it made no practical difference to any legal proceeding. I left it because I had a feeling. And this is the part of this account where I will acknowledge that I am describing a feeling, an unverifiable internal state. And I invite any colleague reading this to weigh it accordingly. I had a feeling that the sheet of paper needed to be where it was, that it was connected to the room in some way I could not professionally quantify, that the room had wanted me to find it, and that having shown it to me, the room wanted it back. I think about the 5 unidentified sites regularly. I have tried in the years since to approach them the way I would approach any piece of unresolved forensic geography, with professional detachment, with the analytical tools I have been trained to use, with the orderly application of methodology to uncertainty. I have tried to treat them as an open question in a closed case, a footnote that the official record chose not to pursue. Sometimes I succeed in this. I will sit at my desk in Moscow with my maps and my case notes, and I will look at the regional geography of the Southern Soviet Union, and I will identify the approximate locations described in Chikatilo's handwritten list with the calm precision of a professional doing her work, and I will think, these are simply places that were never searched, missed by an overburdened and ideologically constrained investigative apparatus, gaps in the record. That is all. And then I will remember the cold in the corner of the archive room, bounded and discreet and present in a way that cold is not supposed to be present. And I will remember the notebook that arranged itself to different pages. And I will remember waking at 3 a.m. to find ink on a nib and writing on a page in no hand that I recognized. And the professional detachment dissolves, and I sit with the maps for a long time without looking at them. The 5 places are at the edges. They are always at the edges. That is the one consistent characteristic I can confirm. Transitional zones, the boundary between what was named and what was not named. The margin of the Soviet project where the organized world ended and the old dark scrubland took over. If they are what I think they are, they have been waiting since sometime in the 1980s, undisturbed, under whatever accumulation of seasons covers an undisturbed place 30 some years now. The sedge grass and wild buckwheat and riverbank elder growing over them without interruption, the boundaries holding, the edges remaining edges. I do not know whether what occupied the corner of that archive room was something produced by the files themselves, by the specific accumulated weight of what those boxes contained, the documented suffering and the institutional failure and the clean execution forms and the single red wool mitten without its pair, or whether it was something specific to Chikatilo. Something that had followed the documentation the way some presences follow objects they have touched. I have no framework for either conclusion. I report only what I observed. I drove out of Rostov-on-Don on a Tuesday morning in late March with the heating in my car set to its maximum setting and the windows fogged and the Don River running dark between its winter-flattened banks on my left side. As I headed north, I did not look at the river. I know the Chikatilo case file well enough to know that rivers are not neutral objects in this story. They are where evidence was carried. They are where the land lets go of what it has been holding. I want to tell you one more thing before I close this account, and it is the one detail I have never included in any professional submission because I have never found a category for it in any analytical framework I have been trained to use. On the last night I spent in Rostov, in the small rented room where I had been staying, I woke at approximately 3 a.m. Not gradually, the way you wake from ordinary sleep, but immediately and completely, the way you wake when something has made a sound. The room was dark. The window showed the orange-gray of a Russian winter sky above a city that never entirely darkens. Everything in the room was where I had left it. My coat was on the chair. My briefcase was by the door. My notes were on the table beside the bed. The notes were open. I had closed them before I went to sleep. I am certain of this because closing my notes at the end of each working day was a habit so deeply ingrained it was essentially automatic, a professional reflex, not a conscious choice. The notes were closed when I went to sleep. They were open when I woke. And this is the detail I have never included anywhere until now. The pen that I had left capped on top of the closed notes was lying across the open pages with its cap removed, and there was ink on the nib, and there was ink on the page. Not in my handwriting, not in any handwriting I could clearly read in the low ambient light of a Russian winter 3 a.m., and I did not turn on the lamp to read it better. I am going to tell you that without apology. I am a rational woman, and I made an irrational decision in that moment. And I stand by it, because there are some pieces of information that you simply do not need. I got up, closed the notes over whatever had been written there, removed the pen and replaced its cap, put on my coat over my pajamas, and sat in the chair for the remaining 3 hours until dawn, watching the window, waiting for the world to come back. I destroyed those notes 3 days after I returned to Moscow. I have thought about this decision every day since. I believe it was the right one. I am not fully certain. Andrei Chikatilo was executed on February 14th, 1994, death by a single gunshot to the back of the head in a soundproofed room in Novocherkassk prison. The execution was standard procedure. The documentation is filed correctly. The form is signed and dated. In the years since his execution, the 5 unmatched locations on the handwritten list have not, to my knowledge, been investigated. I do not know whether this is because no one has found the list or because someone has found it and made the same decision I made. I do not know whether, if you drove to those 5 coordinates today, you would find anything in the transitional zones at the edge of the fields, in the reeds at the waterline. In the marginal places where the world the Soviets built ends and something much older begins. I do not want to know. What I want, what I have wanted since January of 1993, is for the 52 documented victims of Andrei Chikatilo to be the entire story, for the record to be complete, for the file to close. But files, I have learned, do not always close the way the archivists stamp them. Some of them go on, some of them breathe in the corner of the room. Some of them arrange themselves on the table at 3 in the morning, open to a page they want you to read. I will not be going back to Rostov-on-Don. I have filed this account with a private research trust on the condition that it not be released during my lifetime. If you are reading this, some condition has been met that I had not expected to meet. Read carefully. Verify everything you can. Leave the rest where you found it. And if you find yourself in an archive building in the south of Russia, in the deep cold, working through files that the official record wishes had never been assembled, and if the room goes colder from a corner, and the breathing that starts in that corner does not belong to you, do not cross the threshold. Do not answer it. Do not look at whatever the notes have opened themselves to. Some documents were filed because the system needed to contain them. Some rooms hold what they have been given and do not let it settle quietly. Know the difference before you go in. If this account reached you through the archives, make sure the next file is unsealed by following the channel before someone else decides what you should and should not be allowed to read. Survival rule. If you are working through the documentation of a killer who chose his sites by the sound of breathing water in the reeds, and something in the corner of your archive room begins to breathe in the same slow, careful rhythm, leave everything where it is. Do not take the files home. Do not take the notes. Some records know where they belong, and they will follow you until you return them.